General, today we are asking a question many Europeans actually quietly fear. Is the United States stepping back from NATO? And if so, what happens next? I'll ask you a series of clear, focused questions to help our audience understand what's really at stake. Let's begin. What does the new US national security strategy actually tell us about America's priorities? And is Europe becoming less central compared to Asia and the Pacific?
Yes, the US National Security Strategy, which was published last week, is a shift from the traditional US national security strategies. US had a vision of world dominance in the past since the end of the World War, Second World War. Now US is shifting from this to a national interest focused strategy. And that led to also change in its priorities. China is now the number one threat for the United States. Now the United States is making the Indo-Pacific region number one priority. In the past, it was Europe and Middle East. Now, Indo-Pacific region and additionally the Western Hemisphere, meaning the North and South Americas, are number one priority for the United States, and Middle East and Europe is number two.
So, are we seeing a real strategic shift or just political signaling? What concrete indicators should we pay attention to?
So it's a real shift. I mean, United States now wants to disengage from the Middle East and Europe, wants to move its capabilities from Europe to the Indo-Pacific region. That really has become an issue, and it's now alerted Europe. There is a serious debate. There is also a kind of disappointment in Europe. It's one of the top agenda items nowadays in Europe.
So, if US security guarantees become more conditional, as they are right now starting to speak of, is Europe truly ready to defend itself?
There are some challenges, but I think, yes, the main problem here is that the Europeans are exaggerating the Russian threat.
Mhm.
I don't say that there is no threat emanating from Russia, but as I have said earlier, Russia had difficult times only fighting a war in Ukraine. How could Russia fight a war against the European countries? There are 32 countries in NATO. 30 of them are in Europe. And the size of their militaries individually are small, but when they come together, it's a big military. There are 4 countries other than the United States in the top 10 world militaries in NATO. Indeed, Europe has a credible military power that they can deter Russia. Disengagement of the United States from Europe doesn't mean that the United States is completely leaving NATO. They only want to reduce their support to NATO. So it is a gap maybe for some time in Europe, and this gap cannot be filled in a very short time. The United States has an intention to reduce its forces in Europe until 2027. Europeans have 1 year now for this, and in a year, they're not able to fill this gap. But in my opinion, Europe has capabilities that they can deter Russia. And they have already decided to improve these capabilities. There is a 5% GDP pledge of every nation in NATO, although they're going to invest and complete this within 10-year perspective. But they can, to some degree at least, fill this gap. And coming to Russia,
Before that, before that, I would like to ask which European countries are most exposed if American support weakens and why?
Yes, there are small countries which have very little forces. The Baltics region is the most vulnerable region because of its proximity to Russia, because of the size of their population. These countries also have Russian-speaking populations, so Baltics region is more vulnerable to Russia. Russia has a near abroad policy, which Russia wants to expand its influence over the former Soviet or Warsaw Pact countries. But that doesn't mean that Russia will reach its objectives militarily. Russia wants to expand its influence politically, and
I
the
see.
military threat posed by Russia can be countered in Europe.
So, General, I would like to ask this question. Maybe I'm asking this again, but I can't just foresee NATO without US, to be honest. So, I'm thinking, is a US withdrawal from NATO realistic, or is this pressure rather than intent? You said this is really happening strategically, but I would like to deep dive. What is the US's intention?
US needs more forces to deter China in the Pacific region. China is not only economically growing, but also militarily growing, and China really can challenge the United States military in that region. A fight between the US and Chinese forces in the South China Sea may result in very heavy losses for the United States. So the United States wants to deter China, and for this reason, they want to reduce its military presence in Europe. That doesn't mean that the United States will completely leave NATO, in my opinion, because NATO has been a very important instrument of power for the United States. United States used NATO in Afghanistan. NATO served for the national interests of the United States in the Balkans, in Libya, in other parts of the world. So it is a credible military alliance which has well-functioning systems, and it combines together, unites together 32 nations. Why would the United States want to leave NATO?
Mhm.
Anytime the United States needs NATO, it is already a stand-ready capability. And in September 11 attacks,
Yeah.
for the first time, NATO invoked Article 5, although it was symbolic. The Article 5 was invoked. So this
Yes.
is an important power for the United States, and I don't think that the United States will leave NATO completely. But the US policy is that US wants Europeans to take the responsibility of the defense of Europe against the Russian threat. So that will create a gap in Europe in terms of the NATO capabilities. The Europeans believe that they cannot fill this gap in a very short time. But my point is that Russia is not going to fight a war with Europe. I don't expect this because Russian economy is not in a good position. Russia suffered many losses, and the Russian public also does not want a war with Europe. It will be very costly for the both sides. But in the midterm, Russia may try to expand its influence to the Baltics, to the Eastern Europe. This may create a tension. However, the Europeans already, in my opinion, has enough capacity, or at least a capacity, to deter Russia from taking such an action, military action.
Yeah, I think maybe we can talk about like the European Union's initiatives around a global as a like something akin to NATO, right? They are trying to create this kind of new mechanism, new systems.
The European Union had always had a project to have an independent military system other than NATO. But they have failed to create their own independent military forces. The European Union now is trying to allocate financial resources that they can build up new capabilities. The military dimension of this process and the projects are carried out in coordination with NATO. NATO is working with the European Union for how to develop these capabilities, and the financial part of this is mainly trying to be provided by the European Union, because the majority of the NATO countries are at the same time European Union countries. So there is such a coordination system.
So, General, lastly, I'd like to ask, since you know NATO inside, what must NATO actually change to survive the next decade?
It's a very good question. I have to say that first. NATO faced a survival problem at the end of the Cold War because NATO's core mission was to defend its member nations. When the Cold War ended, Soviet Union dissolved, Warsaw Pact disbanded, and indeed there was not a direct threat to the NATO countries. But NATO was not dissolved. The policymakers of the time decided to add new missions to NATO to make it survive. One of them was the crisis management, crisis response operations. NATO assumed such roles, although it was not written in its founding agreement. NATO started carrying out some crisis response operations. Afghanistan operation, for example, falls in this context, or Libya operation or operations in the Balkans all fell in this context. Another one was the security cooperation for the enhancement of security in the Euro-Asia region. This was also another important mission of NATO, which was added after the Cold War. And that made NATO survive. Today, what survives NATO is the Russian threat. So long as there is a Russian threat, NATO survives. I cannot say that there is no any threat from Russia. But in my opinion, as I always say, that the threat level is exaggerated. The European politicians are now trying to make their people believe that Russia is going to attack Europe. This has to be calculated. Europeans need new capabilities. This is true, but there are limits to that. What level, what size of new capabilities are needed to deter Russia? This has to be calculated, and the actions should be taken in accordance with this calculation. There is now a fear that if US leaves NATO, whether NATO could survive. As I said, I don't think that US will leave NATO because NATO as a stand-ready military force organization can serve to the interests of the United States anytime the US needs. Even if the United States leaves, NATO becomes a European organization. NATO unites the Europeans, is a ready military organization which all nations combine their military powers and which is a credible military deterrence capability. So there is no reason, in my opinion, for the Europeans to think that NATO will not survive. I have to also say that NATO is a credible military organization, but NATO has made many mistakes. One of the mistakes that NATO made was its overexpansion towards Russia. I mean, the intention to accept Ukraine and even further Georgia as a member to NATO was a big mistake that provoked Russia, and that resulted in a war in Ukraine. And Ukraine lost Crimea. Ukraine is going to lose maybe Donbass. NATO's expansion can be understandable to a certain degree, but further expansion to the borders of Russia was a big mistake that also has created a mistrust between the Russians and the Europeans, which is very difficult to overcome now.
Thank you for enlightening us, General. These were all of my questions. We'll continue with global conflict analysis next time. Subscribe for expert insight. Leave your questions below. We'll see you next time.